Blundalo. Welcome back to the channel, everybody, and welcome to the library. I'm Tennessee Fats, and I'm coming to you from here today because, well, today I've decided I'm going to take you guys down a bit of a meandering path. A while back on this channel, we did a deep dive into a rather obscure issue of Heavy Metal magazine where we were really doing an expose and covering what was the topic of Dark Watch. When I bought that magazine, though, I had a chance to buy pretty much a whack of ones. And there were a whack of issues that I'd been looking for quite some time for a variety of different reasons. This week I was finally able to dive into one particular issue that I was pretty excited about. And the only reason I was excited about this one, the reason why I really wanted to get it, was because I knew there was an interview in this one issue. And I had not been able to find this anywhere. Finally got my hands on it and finally had a chance to read it. Those of you who saw the thumbnail, you know what issue we're covering today. The issue looks like this. Now hold on. Before everybody goes with the Tennessee Fats really conversation, hear me out. There's a reason why we got this one. But secondly, yes, I did have to get creative with the post-it notes. Yeah. For the purposes of YouTube, we're going to be a little more conservative than what Heavy Metal magazine was all the way back in January of 1998. So what we're going to do today is we're going to turn the camera around, sit down at the desk. I'm going to do a read-along as we go through snippets of this interview that I was so excited to get. Then we'll start walking through some of the other really cool aspects that I found in this magazine. Since I already had it out, I decided to read it from front to back. But then I also want to give you guys a bit of a warning. There are 3 stories in here that kind of left me going, what? I try to grasp stories as best I can, but these ones really left me going, where's the ending? I don't get it. Anyways, at the end of the day, we'll come back here in front of the library and we'll answer the bajillion-dollar question, Tennessee Fats, should I buy this? Well, I guess we'll find out then. Alright, the intro's done. Let's get over to the desk. Let's get into the world's squeakiest chair. And let's dive into, well, a piece of Americana and a piece of historic culture that I really wanted to learn more about in this issue of Heavy Metal. Now I know, Heavy Metal magazine, learning, Americana, history, all of these things don't necessarily go hand in most people's minds. And I'm sure most people are actually still looking at that intro image that I did and saying, Tennessee Fats. Seriously. No, trust me. I read it for the articles. That's actually a joke you'll get probably a little bit later. Here's the deal, guys. I'm a bit of a history nerd, and I always have been, and I'm probably always going to be. And I'm a lot of nerds in a variety of other ways, too. I'm a space nerd. Never mind that now. I have a lot of foibles we could talk about, but that's not really the point of what we're talking about here. One of the aspects of Americana history that's always been a fascinating thing to me is really more around that golden age of Hollywood and movies and music and everything that was really blowing up in the post-war era, which now, here we are in 2025, seems so far away that a lot of what we say and know about that era is really lost. Which is funny because it's so close to us, but a lot of what happened then is probably still so gag-ordered that we're looking at it just with suppositions in a lot of things. One of the aspects that I've always found fascinating is this idea of, and it's a cultural thing, how the explosion of pinups and everything that went with that in the 1950s may have led into how society changed materially going to the 1960s, 1970s, even carrying on to the 80s, and then later on, well, it just continues forever. But the bottom line is it's probably the most influential and pivotal during those 60s and 70s years, where the small changes that you were seeing in that counterculture that was just brewing inside of that Hollywood music whatchamahazard sort of bubble really made its most impact. One of the characters that I've been most interested with at that time is a pinup girl, and I'm saying pinup girl because that's what she's known as, named Bettie Page. Now, Bettie Page is known for a lot of things. She was very popular in, pinup magazines, and we're talking about 1951, I guess, all the way up till about 1957. During that time, there was a bunch of black and white films as well. I've never actually seen the black and white films. But I know that she was very popular in those magazines. But she was also very popular in this sort of counterculture that was growing. And it was a counterculture which was really expanding some ideas around sexuality. And particularly sexuality in women. And what's fascinating is that this sort of thing sort of brewed a little bit. And then it sort of got really quiet. And then it became so much more, 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, and again, diminishes with the actual face-to-face, day-to-day impact. But it's still something that's prevalent and actually has led to where we are today. I've always wanted to learn more about it. I've always said, well, the best way to do it is actually go to the original sources, but I've never really been having a good time finding more and more information about what Bettie Page says, because she was really such a pivotal person at that time. Well, Heavy Metal Magazine actually interviewed her in January of 1997. At that time, she was 74 years old. This is well past her days of actually doing the pinup modeling, and she's being asked a bunch of questions retrospectively. And they're looking back over time saying, well, Betty, what do you think? What's fascinating in these is it really gives you pictures of how she views what her impact was within American culture and how it changed. And I'm not going to read the entire interview for you guys because, well, some of you might be completely disinterested in Bettie Page and that whole subculture that brewed and grew at that point in time completely. Others might be, and if you're interested, you probably want to go out and pick up this particular magazine. But there's a couple of key questions here that I really want to read through because I think they do give you a good picture of what she thought, and also an interesting vignette about one of the comments that she had that was apparently a well-known fact to somebody that we look at very differently today. Yeah, let's get into these quotes. Okay, so the first one of these, I'm getting the pen out of the way. We're just going to get the old magazine out here. We're going to read this along. We're reading along with Tennessee Fats. This is good times here. This is probably the dullest part, so I'll probably try to throw some images or something in here as we go, because looking at me reading can't be that exciting. It's interesting. One of the things, now Jeffrey Goldsmith is the individual that's interviewing Bettie Page here, and I'm supposing this is being done on the phone. Yeah, I'm thinking this is probably being done on the phone. Bear in mind, 1998 is when this thing came out. And Jeff asked the question, my wife wondered if you thought you contributed to the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Yeah, there. We're diving right into the core content that I was looking for here, Jeff. Good job. All right, and Betty responds with, now I figure maybe I did. Not because I was rebellious, into peace or love or into hippie stuff. No, I find it quite funny that she's 74 years old. She was a pinup girl in the 1950s. She's referring to hippie stuff. I think that's quite cool. You know why I think people equate me with the sexual revolution? Because I wasn't uptight. As far as nudity and sex was concerned, I did what I felt like doing no matter what other people thought. That's what must make me stand out. And then Jeff goes a little bit further. And it's interesting hearing Betty's view of this because you're now having her asked a question about something that's going on right around the year 2000. And today, Jeff says, we have sexual freedom and AIDS simultaneously. Doesn't it seem like there's a contradiction? No. No, forget it. I'm not going to make any further comment on that. Betty's responses, and this is actually a really well thought out one. I like this. I pray there's a cure for AIDS very soon. In my eyes, sexual freedom and responsibility to the body go hand in hand. This is Bettie Page we're talking about. That's surprising for me. I didn't believe in being promiscuous. I never did. I don't believe in having sex with every Tom, Dick, and Harry who comes along. Oh. Really? It's kind of funny. Now, I'm going to jump forward a bit here, because that talked a little bit about the sexual revolution thing, but this now I want to dive into something that's more of an opinion piece that really does, I'm going to say it opens a door here to some different chains of thought. Jeff asked the question, anyways, in your opinion, who is the sexiest woman who ever lived? And Betty's response on this one is, perhaps it was Marilyn Monroe, but I'm referencing her in the outward appearance. I've been told she was no great shakes as a lover. What? Yeah. Who told you Marilyn Monroe wasn't a great lover? Immediate response from Jeff. And this is quite funny. I've heard that all my life from a couple of actors who knew her and that I had met in New York. They said that she was nothing in bed, but Marilyn Monroe was a world-renowned figure. Everyone knew of Marilyn. I wasn't nearly that well known. And it's interesting because she goes on and says, I've said before that I think I had better legs than she did. And then there's some other, comparisons that she makes that we won't go into here. And I tell you, I'm going to stop there because I don't want to steal the thunder on this one. There is so much in here. Well, that's for a couple of reasons we're not going to cover. A, I don't want to spoil it. B, there are things in here that, although it still stays above board, we really want to make sure we're following YouTube's community guidelines here and making sure that everybody's happy at the end of the day. So we're going to stop there. I'll tell you, one of the most eye-opening things is just before the interview closes off, though, where it talks about one of the things that Betty did have as an unfulfilled dream. And reading this, honestly, broke my heart. It really did. Got me right in the feels. Now, I know I left that off there with kind of a bummer. I tell you, just, again, rereading it just gets you. And it just, you got to stop for a second. But here's the thing. Reading this only 2-page interview was enough for me that it gave me a little bit of a sense of Bettie's picture of how she pictured herself in the history of the United States and how it fits. But also really gives you one of those things where maybe we shouldn't take all those things we've been told about the 1950s as being sacrosanct. And maybe, and I didn't read it, but I'll tell you, if you look at one of her greatest unfulfilled dreams, just the raw humanity that lives inside these people that we've deified and made into this picture that's larger than life, but they just have basic needs just like you and I do. It's really a fascinating thing here, and it was something that I'd been looking forward to for a long time, and I don't think it disappointed me, even though it was only 2 pages. Such a fascinating thing. I tell you, I strongly encourage anybody who's interested in learning more about this particular topic, by all means, maybe find a copy of this online if you're better online than I am. Or maybe go and pick up a copy of this. I'm pretty sure you could probably still order this from Heavy Metal in their back issues right now, in fact. If you're interested, feel free to go do that. This, to me, made the entire purchase worthwhile. And I'm so glad I have this. Well, such a eyes open to a totally different world sort of experience. So weird. Alright, well, since I had the magazine out, I already bought it. It's the little piece of OCD in the back of my head that says, well, you better read the whole darn thing. And I was kind of surprised in this one, because when I went through it, I didn't find... Well, no. Let's just caveat this right now. I'm going to give you guys my top 3 really cool things that I thought were within this issue. And if you're going to go buy it yourself, I'm not going to spoil it for you, but I'm going to give you little vignettes of what to look for when you get there. Yes, I think that's how we'll go through this, because I think that's kind of appropriate. All right, the first piece that really jumped out of this, because, you know, typically Heavy Metal magazine is going to have 3 or 4 major stories within it that are going to be larger than your, 4 or 5 or 6 page stories. These are the ones that continue for a good level of page count, and this is where Heavy Metal really dives into interesting topics, but also sort of expands the way you look at these topics in these stories. So what Heavy Metal does, it makes you expand the way you think. And there are a couple in here that were really, really interesting, but I was surprised that only 3 really jumped at me. Yeah, let's walk through these. The first one is a story called Meli-Melo. Meli-Melo? Meli-Melo? I'm going to say it's Meli-Melo, M-E-L-I-M-E-L-O, which is a story about a monkey that's in a circus that suddenly one day just starts to be possessed by the recently dead. And it's fascinating because really this circus is now riding on the coattails of the fame of this monkey as it goes along. And the monkey isn't just getting, famous opera singers. It's getting politicians, getting economists, getting business people, famous generals. And it's delivering oratory, just mind-blowing sermons that are really surprising people. It was quite a funny story. And I really liked the sort of interesting twist that came at the end. But I'm not spoiling it. Totally not spoiling it. If you want to find out more about that one, check it out, because it is a really interesting one. And I think it's probably the best typical comic-ish type story that's in this entire issue. Another piece that's in here that I thought was particularly interesting. Remember I talked about, you read it for the articles, kind of like the old Playboy. The joke was that she was in Playboy. That's why it was the joke. When you have to explain the joke, it's just not funny. All right? Anyway, the other thing that's in here is an interesting article, is an interview with Stacey Walker. Now, I had to make sure that I was saying her name correctly, because every time I tried to say this when I was practicing, I spewed out some other garbage. I just, for some reason, couldn't get that last name right. And Stacey's an individual who was highly active in the art and modeling field around the time that this issue came out. So you're talking back to 1998. And what's interesting about that, you'll remember, I was really interested in Bettie Page Interview because it gave me kind of like peeling back this veil so I could see behind what was going on in the 1950s in that sort of area. This interview does a wonderful job of doing exactly that to something that's going on that's even more contemporaneous to the recording of this video. What's going on in this modeling / sci-fi art world? And you really see and you hear about Stacey's relationship with Boris. And at the same time, you also hear about Stacey working with Julie Bell. Now, Julie Bell is a very interesting model and artist where every time I'll see a cover that's done by Julie Bell, I'll make sure I'm picking it up. If you've ever been active on my Instagram, you'll see sometimes I'm throwing up new artwork there. I'm like, hey, check it out. Julie Bell. Really interesting stuff. And in fact, Julie's the individual that did the cover for this, which is really, really cool. But again, peeling back the veil, seeing a little bit more behind the curtain to see what's going on. And I thought that was really well done as well. Now, the last thing in here that really blew my mind, though, was an 8-page story, which even as of now, I still don't understand. I'm still desperately trying to understand what the heck the bird meant in this story. It's a story called Wind. Only 8 pages. I've now read it, I think 6 times, which isn't difficult. As I said, it's only 8 pages and there's very little writing. But I'm trying to piece it together. It's an entirely metaphysical story based in a setting I'm not going to tell you about. But it leaves you, when you get through it, wondering, what the heck just happened? That's really the sign of a good story. You get an ending, and at the same time, you're left with, what was that ending? 3 really cool things that I would encourage you when you're picking up and reading this one. These are the top things you're going to want to look at. Well, besides the Bettie Page article. All right, now I talked about the Bettie Page thing because that was a particular interest to me. Then I said, okay, let's dive into the actual things that were really cool in here that you probably want to look for. And these are the pro things for this one. But there's a con to this issue, and I do want to dive into this right now. This issue, when the whole thing was done, and especially when I closed the last page, left me, and I actually said out loud, what is this, the month of unfinished stories? There are 3 stories in here that are the other 3 big ones. Remember how I said that the Heavy Metal typically has 3 or 4 major stories, or one big story that goes all the way through, and these are what they focus their attention on. For some reason, the 3, other than Meli-Melo, didn't have an ending. Now the first one, and it starts the actual issue of Heavy Metal, and it is then interrupted by other stories and then comes back, is a wonderful story, and I would love to read more about this. It's called The Water. Now this story is an interesting one. It's kind of like a post-apocalyptic war zone type thing. At least I'm assuming it's a war zone. Some sort of environmental disaster has occurred, and this guy is out meandering, and he has visions, and in his visions he envisions water, he envisions this young boy. And the young boy seems to be communicating with him with unrealistic things. And when I read it, I was left with a sense of, well, what is that? Is that a vision? Is it a hallucination? Is it a spirit? I don't understand what that is. And the story goes for a bunch of pages, interrupted. Other stories get put in. Then you come back to it. And I got to tell you, I was so looking forward to when I got back to it and when I was running through it, that when I got to the last page where, unfortunately, our protagonist gets into a bad way, the boy appears. And then there's nothing. There's no end. There's no continue, no fin, no end. Nothing. It just stops. I don't know if this continues in another issue of Heavy Metal magazine. I hope it does. Because I will go and look for this later and see if there's a way for me to continue this. Because it was a really interesting story with so many layers. And that's really another good sign of a good story. Layers, like an ogre or an onion. You just keep peeling it back. And no matter how much it screams, you just keep peeling. That's a good story. Now, the other 2 in here that kind of did the same thing, though, was a story called The Land of Azor, which is kind of like a steampunk murder mystery thing. No spoilers on this one. I'm not telling you who did it. But at the end of it, you're left with a, wait a minute. What about... And then you have to guess. Now, I think I guessed correctly. But the problem is that you don't know. It's literally just one panel at the end that makes you go, wait a minute. And you go, ooh, and I guessed, but it's not an ending. And again, that's 2. Now that there's done it to me. The last one that happened, though, was a story that was called Mamba, Have You Been Seduced? Or Have You Ever Been Seduced? Something like that. And it's a strong female lead story, sexuality being used as a weapon, river pirates, people are dying, and okay, I get where you're going with it, and the story's running along, and you get to 2 panels where you think, okay, well, I guess this is just the last steps now, and then, boom, it just truncates and ends again. That's 3 stories in here that were, well, Land of Azor, pretty good. Water, really good. The Mama story, okay, somewhat rote, I get it, but still a good story, but where's the ending? And I feel like I'm back in the 1980s, and I'm that little old lady in the commercial saying, where's the beef? All right, let's wrap this bad boy up, and let's answer the bajillion-dollar question right now. Should you go buy this? Well, I'm of 2 thoughts on this. I specifically went out and bought this because I wanted to make sure I could read the words of Bettie Page. I wanted to learn more about her, and I wanted to get more of an understanding about how she thought, what was going through her head. So for me, this fulfilled a quest. This filled an itch that was sitting in the back of my mind. So to me, yes, absolutely you should buy this. But to you, the average reader, what would you think of this? You don't have an interest in Bettie Page. Maybe you don't want to read that interview. Should you pick this up? Well, there are a couple really cool, smaller stories in here that really made me, at the end of the day, go, what happened here? And we already walked through those in this video. There are a couple stories that, for me as a reader, I was left a little lost at the end. And I recognize I'm a little slow when it comes to reading some stories, but I still think that these three big ones that were within here should have had a more definitive ending, and they didn't. So should you pick this up? Well, if you're interested with something to sit on your coffee table that you can read some light material and enjoy some lighter stories, this has a lot of fun in it for the stories that I pointed out. Maybe you want to steer clear of those larger stories and getting invested in them, because maybe you'll find there isn't an ending as well. But maybe that was just a me issue. Should you pick it up? Yeah, you probably should. Should you pick it up for maybe 30, 40, 50, 100 bucks? No, absolutely not. This should be a cheap issue that you have on a table where you can read it, and at the end of it, when you say, I'm done, you say, I'm glad I got the information. Definitely not something that's going to sit here and make or break a collection, but it is a fun one to have on a coffee table just to thumb through. Well, everybody, that's my video for this week. I hope you enjoyed this one. We'll see you in the next video.